Hi, my name is Ashley Brown, and I'm President and CEO of the Women's Resource Center. And thank you for joining us as we continue our conversations as part of the Elevating Women's Voices campaign. We're going to talk about gender socialization and gender boxes today, and I am joined with the perfect person to talk about this topic with, Scott Osborne. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I know. So give us a little background on why you are the perfect person and the work that you're doing in gender.
Yes, I do a lot of work in gender. Right now I'm the president of a local not-for-profit called Through Women's Eyes, and we're a gender equality organization where we run a film festival and many other things, and hopefully we'll talk about that one day. But before that, I was a lawyer, but then I worked for not-for-profits internationally. I lived in 7 different countries and did a lot of social research about women's programs, women's economic opportunities, poverty issues, gender issues, masculinity. I lived in India and Africa 3 times. So I've been fortunate to have lots of experiences. I also was a teacher for some years, so I think a lot about youth, and I do a lot of research on gender. So I love putting all these pieces together now. It's a super interesting time for this topic.
Well, and I think the first time we met was actually through Sarasota Women's Alliance.
Oh, possibly.
And
yes.
Just had a great conversation on all of the ways that you look at where gender is in our everyday life, whether it's in the business relationships we have, the personal relationships. So thank you for the work you do. Thank you for your willingness to participate. I do want to say this is one of 3 discussions that we're having on this particular topic, but I look forward to future film festival, media and messaging, all of that good stuff. But we're going to start today with a deeper dive into gender socialization. You did about a 15-minute presentation that's on the website that I would encourage people to watch as well. But I want to talk about at the Women's Resource Center, we refer to the state of women. And what are the realities for women in our region? And the reality is that women are overrepresented in poverty. They're overrepresented in the population that struggles. I think people are surprised to know that 40%, 44% of Manatee County households and about 38% of Sarasota households live below a sustainable wage. Single female head of households, way overrepresented, 66% Sarasota, 72%. So of those numbers, so when we talk about that, we know what's happening locally, but can you give us a picture of what's the global picture and how does it all fit in?
Sure, as you can tell from my background, I think a lot about the global, but I think there's a lot of connections today. You know, we live in a global world. So it's interesting. People sometimes say to me, what do you really mean gender equality? How do we measure that? How do we get at that? You just ask people? I mean, what indicator are we looking at? And it's interesting that we can compare countries. I mean, there are organizations that do this, and they look at a basket of indicators, and I think it's super worthwhile to think about what they put in there to measure it. And they, economists and social science researchers, put in 4 baskets of things that they can quantify. The first is education. Do men and women have comparable educational attainment, boys and girls? Health. How are the health statistics? If you've got a big disparity, then of course that would be very telling. Economics, which includes income, jobs, wealth, assets, etc. And then political representation in whatever the social system is. So they look at these baskets of 4 things and determine equality rankings. And as a country, as a nation, the U.S. is 43rd in the world out of about 120, 130 countries that are ranked. So for people who thought we were right up there, and this is not just below some of the Scandinavian countries, which are known for their high gender equality markings, but much of Western Europe, Canada's above us, but also countries like Namibia and Serbia and Costa Rica and all over the world. There are many countries which are better on this gender equality ranking. And without going into all the details on that, the 2 areas that we're great at are health and education. Many people know women are achieving educationally. Big picture, our health is similar. But where we are lagging phenomenally is the area of economics, pay, employment, et cetera. You mentioned the poverty statistics, more women are in poverty. And then political representation. If you look at both our national offices, the Congress, as well as our state legislatures, very rarely do women get above 30%. We're about 28% in Congress now, about 33. So those are what we call lagging indicators that show a real inequality.
And what do you think some of the reasons, and it's interesting, we did a segment on women in politics and the importance of having female representation. So, aside from that, what do you think some of the reasons are for the big gap?
Sure, it's interesting. I put it into two baskets. One of them is systemic. We've historically, we live all in patriarchies through history. That's none of the responsibility of the people on the planet today. This is our history. So for many, many hundreds, thousands of years, it's predominantly been men in most societies who have been, as I say, making the rules. So we still have a legacy of a huge number of policies, laws, regulations, structures, which I will say favored men. It didn't always work out great for men. I'm not saying it did, but they were made for men. And so it's only very recently, really in the span of time, that women have moved into workforces and educational opportunities. So that's part is kind of systemic. And then there's socialization, which is the very human part. And we've been socialized in certain ways. It's the soft stuff. Most of the science research today says men and women's brains are not that different. The thing that makes us so different, why men and women are looking differently and wearing their hair a certain way and talking and having certain hobbies that are different, is primarily socialization. And that's very deep-seated, it's powerful, but the good thing is socialization can change over time, and it can change in ways as long as we want to. And I'm gonna kind of can I plug a book for 1 minute?
Absolutely.
And I get no proceeds. I just think it's a super cool book. It's called Invisible Women, and you can put something on your website maybe, but this book talks about how the world was made by men. And I don't want to malign men unfairly. It's not like they sat around and said, we're going to disenfranchise the women necessarily, but it's just they were the only ones at the table when laws and policies were made, so that's how it worked out. It shows the traces of that through time. Very interesting book, but the point is I think this inequality is both systemic, which we can work on, economic, political changes, and socialization, which is really what we wanted to talk also more about today.
And when we talk about socialization, as I was watching your first session, one of the things that you touched on is it starts with the gender reveal, which we'll have our own whole show on the whole gender reveal thing of just like really, like we need cannons and but that's for another show. But it really does, when you break down when we start thinking of our young people in terms, and it was done to us as, this is a girl, she'll have a pink room, or I'll get a pink outfit, or a boy, so I'm going to go with blue, or it really is layer upon layer of not only messaging, direct and indirect.
Huge amount of conditioning. And I want to empathize, this is obviously something very deep-seated in people, and most people don't do it to harm either gender, because I would argue that it's not working out super well for boys and men either. And we have another show about men. It's not working out super well for men. Men have higher rates of suicide and alcoholism and other issues. And, I'm very empathetic to that. I want to say, what are we doing to our boys? It's also not working out too great for many women who are in poverty, who suffer other issues. So I would say maybe if we can kind of break down those boxes a little bit, both sides will do better. If we were a little more fluid, but we do have, and we talk about in the social sciences, the so-called man box and the woman's box. And you can see that very powerfully. There's a lot of research with young children, how it's manifested. And as a refresher, if people haven't seen the video on socialization, the key things in the man box that men and boys absorb from early on is that men are supposed to be dominant. They, as we call, own the room. And you'll see competition among boys and men to kind of establish that. There's a preference for hierarchical systems because of that notion of dominance. There's a suppression of many emotions for men, except anger. You know, a lot of, if you think about our movies and things which glorify violence, and, you know, men showing anger and aggression is seen as very masculine. But other emotions, not so much. A number of these things are kind of in the man box, and also is not to do or act like anything feminine, to sort of eschew all the feminine. And again, you will see boys at a very young age who have picked this up. You know, nobody told them directly, but they have picked up. If something is seen as quote unquote girly, boy, they're going to police each other from very young ages. It's fascinating. So that's traditional. And I should say there's tons of exceptions. I'm not speaking to everyone or about everyone, but this is the kind of traditional socialization which is very well documented. And in the women's box is, do you think you know what the first thing is that women are really socialized to care and worry about and spend their time thinking? Do you want to make
Appearance.
Yes. Appearance.
Appearance would
How
be
you look.
right. That was not
Yes.
That was not pre-done. So yeah, how you look.
And exactly, and then it's not biological. That is, and it's so deeply socialized that that's women's calling card, if you will, and time, attention, and effort, and that's huge. Women are also taught through the socialization to really think about and worry about other people's emotions, often putting their needs and thoughts above their own. So some women in the extreme almost lose themselves in the care for other people. And I'm by no means opposed to care for children or parents or our loved ones, but the overdominance of that for many women is a challenge. So we've got these men's and women's traditional socialization boxes, and they're still with us today in many ways.
Well, and you can see it in workplace. We see it and we're going to talk about some of the occupational segregation of what's a traditional male job or female. A conversation I've had more than once, because the gender pay gap is something that we look at the center, is people, and they truly are like, that doesn't exist anymore. And I don't think that I think that there's fewer people that, and I would hope that no one's intentionally being like, oh, I'm going to pay you less because you are a woman. But the data is the data. And the reality is, I think it was it 2023 that it widened for the first time.
First time in 20 years. Yes. So let's talk about what that means, because
So it's real.
It's real.
It's real.
The gender pay gap is real. And there's a difference between bias and discrimination. If you're talking about people being paid differently for the same job because of gender, that's a legal term. They may have discrimination. It's that much less. I'm not saying that never goes on, but that happens much less. But the gender pay gap is looking at the averages. So on median, men's median pay scale now, I think in the US is about 66,000, and for women it's about 55,000. So, and this has tracked consistently as long as they've been tracking it. The gap has shrunk. In 2023, it expanded again for the first time. So it's because of these averages that we say women get paid about 82 cents for every dollar that men get. That's a term that people hear a lot. It is absolutely 100% real for reasons that we can talk about. Again, these are averages. Of course, people will know a very well-paid woman and a man who is not paid as well, which does not change the overall thing. Something else that's important about that, too, is that there's also what's called a wealth gap. That's the pay gap. Again, it's about 82 cents to the dollar. But there's a wealth gap, which is closer to 55 cents to the dollar, which is why we have so many more women in poverty. And that's showing that over time, what kind of wealth and assets do women have or can they accumulate? And it's much less. And this is an issue certainly for elder women, but throughout their lifetime. And what it shows is the accumulation of this pay gap. It shows that women also are more likely to have to stop out of work for motherhood or other caregiving responsibilities. It's also perpetuated to some extent by our policies. If women have not paid as much into Social Security, for example, they're going to be getting less in many instances when they retire. So we have a real wealth gap for women that's even bigger than the pay gap.
And something that we talk about again at the center is the asset building. And it's interesting that, and I didn't think about it, but it makes total sense. When we talk about the conditioning of caring for others, putting other people first, that also goes into asset building, wealth building as mothers. Oh, I'm going to put this into savings, or Scott really wants to participate in this event. I'm going to sacrifice my savings and make sure that my child has the ability to do. So it's not for ill-conceived reasons. It's just not benefiting ultimately. And then it creates a cycle, because oftentimes then children are having to take care of their parents because they don't have the ability to support themselves as they're aging. So it's a very cyclical.
Very cyclical. There's many, on that issue, it's interesting about women, what they will use, quote unquote, extra resources for, because we look at this a lot globally. I did a lot of international work, and aid and other programs, they will try to channel money to women who are far more likely to either reinvest in a family farm, reinvest in their children's education. You might say that's a wonderful benefit from the socialization of caring for other people. And it's well documented that at least today, men are less likely to do that, to make those kind of investments. But I would also say that it, perpetuates the care burden. If you're taking care of then elderly parents or something, it's too often, a female, a daughter, who has that responsibility still.
And not only is it the daughter, but it's just assumed that it will be, which I think that's where we get into just some of the subconscious behaviors that have been ingrained for generations. This is not something that was an intentional thing that our parents did, or that it's
we've all
just
inherited this system. We're all born into it. I don't want to leave off, though. We can talk about that more in the whole care economy, but systemic issues are important here too. We don't have any kind of social services to support parenting or elder care, as many developed Western economies do. We are the only ones without any kind of guaranteed maternal care. So the U.S. really, in terms of providing social services to all of its citizens, we're phenomenally lacking. Western Europe, when people talk in global terms, they'll say, well, Western Europe has social policies and America has its women. And in a way, that's kind of what it looks like because of the care burden.
Well, and the systemic issues, and we talk programmatically that programming can change the lives of some. Policy changes, system changes for many.
It changes the terrain.
It does. And it just is not only in terms of affordability, accessibility, opportunity, but how we think about things as well, and what judgments are made. And, when you look at single female head of households that are raising children and the things that they're juggling, and the fiscal cliffs of having benefits, which is when you talk to people, men and women, business owners, about, all right, here are the realities, people are like, oh, that does not make sense. We shouldn't be doing that. But then actually getting the changes to happen, I think, is part of the foundation of this work we're doing with elevating women's voices, or normalizing these conversations.
Absolutely, and I think it goes back to the representation. Remember, we said there was two lagging areas, sort of economics, but also political representation. Because we do not, in our culture, have nearly as many men involved in care work, whether it's for their children, for elderly, paid or unpaid, and we know that the vast majority of our elected officials are men, it's impossible for them to have lived experience and know what this is like. So when policies come up, in a way, it's not surprising. Even men who might otherwise think they're supportive, etc., they're not necessarily going to have the same perspective as women typically do. Again, we're generalizing, but there's a reason why their life experience has been so different. If there were more women who were decision makers, business, politics, they would tend to have more lived experience of this aspect of life that men don't. So it relates to full circle. It comes back to.
Well, and before we go on to the fun thing of the work and career and those boxes, I think, and we were having this conversation before we started our taping, is women's issues, or even the topics of the gender pay gap and that piece, are seen as political And I think that we could really do a service by saying these are not political issues. It shouldn't be a partisan issue. It's about how we want to talk about and create and work together with everyone in our community in kind of unison of
I couldn't agree more. And not
moving
only
forward.
nonpartisan, you know, my organization, we're a 501c3, we're nonpartisan. I always say gender equality is not a political issue. You know, it is not. It also shouldn't be seen as a women's issue.
Right.
Gender should not be seen. It's not a bad thing for men to talk about, the same as we might talk about any other social topic. This is part of our society. This is some of the ways we're raised, whether we like it or not. We can say what we want to change. We can even healthfully disagree or agree. But it shouldn't be seen as a niche female political issue. This has impact for all of us, our sons, you know, our fathers. It's so I agree completely. It really needs to be sort of normalized that this is a creature of our societies that is worth talking about. I sometimes say to teachers, you know, if you talk about history, do you talk about like patriarchies or role of gender? I mean, these are social structures. Talk about it. So it does need to be brought into the mainstream.
Yeah, and I just think the more we talk about and normalizing talking about it, and it doesn't have to be a divisive topic. It is just, you know, here's the realities of what people are dealing with, and how can we change that narrative?
And I sometimes say, you know, I'm not inherently criticizing anyone on this planet. None of us created this system. We have all inherited it. Men, women, everybody has inherited it. I expect people, hopefully, to at least look at it, be a little bit open to change, recognize change is hard and slow for men and women. It's not our fault. We were brought into this system as well. But at least to be honest and forthright about having that conversation and being able to look at some changes. Yeah.
Which, you know, then I think goes to the fun topic of occupational segregation.
It's a mouthful.
Well, it is. But when we look at, again, at the center, thinking about our scholarship program, which has been in existence for over 25 years, amazing, just giving direct scholarships and wrap services and helping people who don't have the education to get training, certifications, to get higher paying wages. The majority of our scholars are in nursing because, and we need nurses, we need people in the medical field, but again, that is a traditionally female care economy when you look at teachers, nurses, caregivers, all of those things. And once you become an RN or get your master's in nursing, your earning potential is exponential. But the entry level CNA, LPNs, they're not earning enough as an hourly rate. So looking at not only what's your trajectory, but how long is it going to take you to get to a living wage? So talking about non-traditional occupations for women, and whether it's light manufacturing or construction or those types of fields. But when we talk about systemic issues, traditional occupational boxes lead us into economic disparity from the beginning.
It does. And this also has both systemic and socialization causes, but the occupational segregation is a huge one. And I personally wish that so many more, whether it's nursing, all these other fields, were much more diversified gender. We need more men in nursing. It will, not only will it change the profession and the care and all, but it may also increase the pay scales. The occupational segregation basically says that women tend to be more represented in a basket of lower paying jobs, which tend to be things like retail, which is also notoriously hard for scheduling, low pay traditionally, very low job tenure, nursing and some of the sort of lower tier medical professions, care work, formal, informal is a whole other topic, and things like teaching, especially elementary, preschool, et cetera, teaching. Women tend to be clustered in that, heavily overrepresented. Men still heavily clustered in things like tech, engineering, You know, heavy manufacturing, heavy equipment operating, to say nothing of CEOs. Most business owners are still males. You go up hierarchies and it tends to be males. So we know, and engineering fields especially, very well remunerated. So we know women are not going into those fields. Some of this is due to early discrimination, the legal form. There's much less of that now, but there is still bias. There is still, excuse me, biases that start early in education. We talked about how early boys and girls see themselves as gender coded. A lot of that tracks into it. If you see a field that is overwhelmingly male and you're a little girl, it doesn't really look like something you can go into, as well as some of the preliminary steps leading up to it. The educational fields, you might not feel that those are right for you. But I always encourage women to really look at non-traditional jobs. I would encourage men as well to destigmatize it. You know, it's unfortunate that men stigmatize something like nursing, when in fact that would be an excellent profession for many of them. But breaking down those walls would help, and it would help with the issue of economic disparities, and it would help our pay gap. The pay gap is not just occupational segregation, but it's a big part of it.
So as we go to wrapping up our conversation, it goes so fast. What are some practical things? You know, I think we've touched on a couple of them, but what are some other practical things that we can do, both as men and women, to start shifting the narrative on this whole conversation?
Yeah, that's really important. I just want to say one thing first, is that the economic disparities is also due to the whole motherhood penalty, which we haven't talked about. You'll see women and men tracking almost identically until the woman has children, if she chooses to have children or adopt children, and then you see a huge disparity because we have no support, and someone has to take care of children in general. Things we can do. I think of it, I sometimes call it the 3 Ps: your person, your profession, and your politics. So think about what you do as a person. I think to shift gender socialization, I always say to people, don't let small things slide. Socialization comes from small things. Watch what you do with children and young people. We are all, whether we have our own children or not, we are all modeling for the next generations. So be very aware of that traditional socialization and say to yourself, do I want to perpetuate this? You know, many women also play a role in this. This is not just something that men, quote unquote, do to women.
Correct.
Women will self-police on something like appearance. You know, my women friends know not to talk about my appearance. It's like, no, don't center that. You know, let's talk about something else. Women should know not to subtly or otherwise sneer at men who perform more, quote unquote, traditional feminine roles like childcare and housekeeping. Watch yourself with that. We want to applaud that flexibility and not be critical of it. So I think that's sort of the personal side. Professionally, obviously seek other jobs. You know, think about and broaden your perspective. If you absolutely want to be a nurse, go with my blessing. But be open to some of those other jobs. You know, you may be the first, you may be the only woman in the room for a while, but you will not be the last. Really consider them. They might be very rewarding.
And informational interviews in that regard.
Yes,
Like if you have any interest, there's people who are always willing to have those conversations.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And then, of course, there's the political. You know, we need policies about choice. We need policies that will support things like parental care and parental leave. You know, there's a huge paucity of these in our country. So when you are making your decisions about politics, whatever they might be, inform yourself. You know, will these candidates or these parties really help issues that are important to you as a woman, and know that those do have value and they should be looked at. So the 3 Ps: person, profession, and politics.
There you go, which is a nice, succinct way to do it. And I do want to give reference to your website.
Thank you.
Where there's lots of information.
Lots of gender equality information. I do
Yes.
other things with the gender equality information. It's Osborne, ESCOTTOSBORNE.com.
And I think we have to have another show because we didn't even talk about so many things around the younger men and women and some of the shifts we're seeing there. So
fascinating topics.
We will schedule that for later, but I want to thank you for joining, sharing your expertise with us. And thank you for joining us on Elevating Women's Voices. Again, I encourage you to go to Scott's website. You can find other videos and information on the Elevating Women's Voices webpage. at mywrc.org. And again, thank you. This has been a really rich
Thank you.
discussion, and I appreciate all you're doing.
I applaud you all for doing this. Thank you.
I know. Great. And we'll see you next time on Elevating Women's Voices.